He ran an empire built on fear. $400 million, 43 floors above Manhattan. Men who trembled when he walked into a room. Chae-won-so, the Korean mafia boss they called the Silence, had survived bullets, betrayals, and the collapse of men far more powerful than himself. Nothing reached him. Nothing broke through. Until her. She was a black woman with a cardboard box of spices, a cherry red apron, and absolutely no idea who she was cooking for. Layla Voss didn't come with weapons. She didn't come with threats. She came with a wooden spoon and a melody she didn't even know she was making. And she walked straight into the most dangerous kitchen in New York City. He heard her humming on the very first morning, and something inside the most bloodthirsty man in the city stopped. But not everyone wanted her there. One of his most trusted men looked her in the eye and told her to disappear. Told her this kitchen wasn't for her. That she should take the money, take the warning, and never come back. And then she found the article, the name, the truth about exactly who she had been cooking for all along. What she did next changed both of them forever. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a kind of silence that only money can buy. Not the silence of empty rooms or forgotten places. Not the silence of countryside or open water. This is a different silence entirely. Curated, enforced, architectural. The silence of a penthouse 43 floors above Manhattan, where the city below screams and bleeds and laughs and mourns, and none of it, not a single vibration of it, climbs high enough to be heard. Triple pane glass, reinforced concrete, 12-inch walls. And somewhere behind all of that engineering, the deeper silence of a man who decided, a very long time ago, that noise was dangerous. Chae-won-so had not always lived this way. But he had lived this way long enough that he could no longer remember what the other way felt like. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 43rd floor, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city the way a general watches a map. Not with wonder, not with affection, but with the cold geometry of someone who understood that everything visible was also, in some essential way, a liability. The Hudson gleamed silver far to his left. The streets below moved like circuitry. 43 floors of insulation between himself and all of it, and still, somehow, he felt the pressure of it constantly. The weight of everything he had built pressing up from below, looking for cracks. There were no cracks. He had made certain of that. Mr. Kwon stood near the door with a folder in his hands, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned, over 14 years of service, that the optimal posture in this room was invisible. He was a lean, gray-templed man of 51 who had once been a detective in Seoul and was now something far more useful. He waited. He was very good at waiting. The Reyes situation, Chae-won said. He did not turn from the window. Resolved, Mr. Kwon said. As of this morning. And the contact at the Port Authority? Transferred. The new one is already aligned. Chae-won nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement that information had been received and filed. He said nothing further on either subject. There was nothing further to say. Problems existed. Problems were resolved. The machine moved forward. This was the rhythm of his life, and it had been the rhythm of his life for so long that he had stopped experiencing it as anything other than ordinary. The new chef arrives tomorrow, Mr. Kwon said. He placed the folder on the edge of the desk, The same desk that had, 3 weeks earlier, belonged to a man named Victor, who had cooked for Chaewon for 2 years before making the catastrophic error of selling information to a rival faction. Victor was no longer available for comment. Her references are clean, no associations. She came through the hospitality agency. They believe she was hired for a private residence on the Upper East Side. A pause. She was not told otherwise. For the first time, Chaewon turned from the window. He looked at the folder without touching it. She knows nothing about this operation? Nothing. Keep it that way, he said. She cooks, nothing more. She does not ask questions about the staff, the schedule, or the visitors. If she does, she won't, Mr. Kwan said. She is, by all accounts, entirely focused on her work. Former culinary instructor, spent 2 years in Seoul. He said that last part with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided in advance not to assign significance to it. She speaks some Korean, basic level. Chaewon looked at the folder for another moment. Then he turned back to the window. Make sure her quarters are adequate. I don't want complaints. Mr. Kwan allowed himself one small internal observation, that this was the first time in recent memory the boss had expressed any consideration whatsoever regarding staff comfort, and then filed it away without comment. Of course, he said, and left. The kitchen was the only room in the penthouse that Chaewon saw never entered. This was not a formal rule. No one had declared it. It had simply evolved. The way certain silences evolve in a household, through repetition and the particular gravity of unspoken things. The kitchen existed at the western end of the residence, separated from the formal rooms by a corridor that felt, in some architectural way, like a border. The staff who operated there, the previous ones in rotation, understood without being told that the kitchen was functional, not social. Food went out. Chaewon ate. Plates returned. The cycle completed itself without ceremony. He ate alone. Always alone. At the long dining table, or more often, at the desk in his office, reading documents or watching markets, or doing the specific kind of nothing that looks like thinking. He had, over the years, eaten food prepared by 12 different chefs. He could not have told you what any of them looked like. He could not have told you what the food tasted like either. Not really. He ate because the body required it. He ate the way he slept, efficiently, joylessly, and only as much as necessary. What he did not know, what he could not have known, standing at his window on that particular evening, was that everything was about to change. Not in the dramatic, sudden way that things usually changed in his world, with a phone call, a gunshot, a name on a list. It was going to change the way weather changes in the mountains. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. She arrived the next morning at 7:42 with 2 wheeled suitcases and a cardboard box that she refused to let the building's service staff carry. Layla Voss held that box against her chest with both arms, like it contained something irreplaceable, which, in her estimation, it did. Inside, 14 jars of spices, 3 specialty vinegars, a hand-worn copy of a cookbook that had belonged to her grandmother, 2 small ceramic bowls she had bought at a market in Insadong during her time in Seoul, and a cloth bag of dried mushrooms that she had not been able to find in any American market that met her standards. She stood in the service entrance of the building and looked up at it with the focused, appraising expression of a woman who sized up kitchens the way other people sized up people, looking for the truth beneath the presentation. The building was extraordinary. She had known that from the address alone, but the reality of it was different from the knowing. 43 floors of dark glass and steel, the kind of building that declared its own importance without apology. She thought, whoever lives here has more money than they know what to do with. She thought, this is a very long way from Atlanta. She thought briefly and practically, this salary will pay off 8 months of debt in 4. She did not think about who specifically she was cooking for. Not yet. She had been told a private executive, a man of Korean descent. Dietary notes: no shellfish, low tolerance for heavily fried food, preference for traditional Korean cuisine when possible. She had been told he was a very private person who required absolute discretion. She had heard that before. Rich people were always private. It meant they had things they didn't want discussed, which was fine, because she didn't come to discuss things. She came to cook. Mr. Kwon met her in the corridor outside the kitchen. He was shorter than she had expected from his voice on the phone, and his face had the particular quality of a man who had trained himself out of all unnecessary expression. He handed her a card with a security code. He showed her the pantry, the cold storage, the spice wall, fully stocked with Korean ingredients, she noticed immediately, and well stocked at that. Someone had ordered properly. She revised her estimation of the household upward by several degrees. The principal takes breakfast at 8:30, Mr. Kwon said. Lunch, when he takes it, is at 1. Dinner at 7:30 without exception. He does not come to the kitchen. You will send everything out through the pass-through. She looked at the pass-through, a sleek rectangular opening in the wall, large enough for a tray. He never comes in here? She asked. No, Mr. Kwon said. He said it with a certainty that felt almost like a warning. Never. She looked around the kitchen one more time. The copper pots hanging in rows, the marble counter wide and cool under her palm, the 6-burner stove with its heavy iron grates, the light, warm and diffuse, coming through the frosted window above the sink. She set her box of spices down on the counter. She began to unpack. And somewhere in the arrangement of small jars, the gochugaru and the doenjang and the sesame oil and the dried anchovy, she began, without meaning to, without noticing, to hum. It was nothing, a shapeless melody, warm and low, rising naturally from somewhere in her chest the way it always did when she was in a kitchen that felt right. She hummed the way she breathed, without thinking about it, without performing it, without any awareness that it was happening at all. The sound moved through the kitchen. It found the corridor. It traveled, soft and unhurried, down the length of the hallway toward the office where Chae-won-seo was sitting at his desk, reading a document that had, until that moment, had his complete attention. He stopped reading. He did not know why at first. He sat very still, the document held in both hands, and listened to something he could not immediately identify. Something that was arriving from a direction he had not expected, carrying something he had not felt in a very long time. He sat like that for a long time. Outside, 43 floors below, the city made its enormous noise. Up here, the expensive silence held. And inside it, quietly, something began. He did not go to the kitchen that day. He returned to the document. He read the same paragraph 4 times and retained nothing from it, which was, for a man whose mind operated with the precision of a financial instrument, an event without precedent. He set the document down. He stood. He went to the window, which was his habitual response to any disruption in his internal order, and he stood there until the city below reasserted itself as the primary object of his attention. The humming had stopped by then. Or perhaps it had not stopped. Perhaps it was simply too faint to reach him anymore, muffled by distance and corridor and the 12-inch walls that kept everything out. Either way, The silence had returned to its proper state. Curated. Enforced. His. He told himself it was nothing. A new variable in the household, briefly noticed, now catalogued and filed. The brain registers novelty. This was basic neurology, not sentiment. A new sound in a quiet environment would naturally attract attention. It meant nothing beyond that. He was not a man who permitted things to mean more than they were. He believed this. Completely and without reservation, he believed it. By the time dinner arrived, sent through the pass-through at precisely 7:30, as instructed, on a tray with a folded linen napkin and a small ceramic dish of banchan arranged with a care that his previous chefs had never bothered with, he had almost forgotten the incident entirely. He sat at his desk, pulled the tray toward him, and lifted the lid from the main dish. The steam rose first, then the smell. And the smell was something else altogether. Something that did not behave like smell, but like memory. Arriving without permission and bypassing every rational defense he had constructed in 38 years of living. 된장찌개. Fermented soybean paste, its deep oceanic earthiness cut through with the brightness of zucchini and the soft weight of tofu. The broth dark and complex, and alive in a way that the dish rarely was when made by someone who cooked it from knowledge rather than from feeling. She had cooked it from feeling. He understood this instantly, and did not want to understand it. He ate slowly. He finished everything. He sat for a moment after the last spoonful with the spoon still in his hand and the bowl empty before him. And something moved through him that he could not name precisely. Some compound of recognition and grief, and the warmth that he had no current category for. He put the spoon down. He put the lid back on the bowl. He pushed the tray to the edge of the desk and opened his laptop and returned to work. He did not think about it again that night. This, as it happened, was a lie he told himself with exceptional skill. The second morning arrived the way all mornings arrived in that apartment, announced by light rather than sound, the sun cutting in at low angles through the eastern glass, finding the edges of furniture and the surfaces of things. Chaewon was already awake. He was always already awake. Sleep for him was a transaction, a minimum investment for a functional return, and he completed it with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. He showered, he dressed. He stood at the window with black coffee that Mr. Kwan had prepared before 7, which was the one domestic task that Chaewon had never delegated to a chef, had never wanted delegated, because there was something in the making of his own coffee, or in having it made by the one person in his life he had trusted for 14 years, that felt like the last remaining gesture of normalcy. Everything else in the apartment was performance. The coffee was just coffee. At 8:15, he sat at his desk. At 8:30, the breakfast tray came through the pass-through. Soft tofu soup this time, sundubu-jjigae, silken and trembling in its stone bowl, with a raw egg cracked in at the last moment and a scatter of scallion across the surface. Simple, precise. The kind of dish that punishes any technical carelessness and rewards only genuine understanding. He ate it. He said nothing. At 9:03, he noted the time without meaning to, which was itself significant. The humming began again. It reached him differently today. He was sitting closer to the corridor. The morning was quieter than the evening had been, fewer staff on the floor, the security rotation not yet fully shifted. The sound traveled cleanly. It was the same formless melody as before, warm and unhurried, rising and dipping in a pattern that was not quite random, but not quite composed either. It was the sound of a person thinking out loud through music. It was the sound of someone who was, in the most complete sense of the word, at ease. Chaewon sat very still with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. She was not performing. That much was immediately clear. In his world, everything was performed. Every word calculated, every gesture a message, every silence a strategy. He lived inside performance so completely that he had largely forgotten what its absence looked like. But this was its absence. This was a woman alone in a kitchen, making food for a person she had never met, and finding in that ordinary task something that made her sing without knowing she was singing. He set the coffee cup down. He looked at the doorway to the corridor. He did not go. He stayed at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at figures that refused to resolve into meaning. The humming continued for another 20 minutes, then softened, then stopped. Replaced by the sounds of cooking, the rhythmic percussion of knife against board, the hiss of something hitting a hot pan, the clatter of a pot lid. He was aware that he was listening to all of it. He was aware that this was new. He said nothing to Mr. Kwon. There was nothing to say because there was nothing to report. Nothing that could be stated plainly in the vocabulary of operational assessment that governed all communications in this household. He could not say, "The new chef's humming is doing something I don't have language for." He could not say, "I finished the entire bowl last night, and the experience was not purely physical." He could not say, "I recognized something in that sound, and the recognition was not comfortable." So he said none of it. Instead, on the third day, he did something small and apparently inconsequential that Mr. Kwon noted with the precision of a man who tracked small, inconsequential things for a living. He changed his walking route through the apartment. Not dramatically, not obviously. He simply began, on the third morning, taking the western corridor to his private office rather than the eastern one. The western corridor passed the kitchen. The eastern one did not. The western route was 8 seconds longer, which was, for a man as calibrated as Chaewon-so, an eternity. He took it anyway. He did not enter the kitchen. He walked past the entrance. The door was open, the morning light inside warm and amber-toned, the smells of cooking already gathering in the air. And he did not pause, did not slow, did not look. But the sound reached him in those 8 additional seconds, and the sound was enough. On the fourth day, he slowed. Not to a stop, just a fractional reduction in pace, the kind of thing that would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching very carefully. Mr. Kwon, walking a respectful distance behind, was watching very carefully. He said nothing. He filed it. On the 5th day, Chaewon stopped entirely at the kitchen entrance for a period of time that Mr. Kwon later estimated at 30 seconds. He stood in the corridor with his hands behind his back, his default posture, the posture of the window, the posture of the map-reading general. And he looked into the kitchen without entering it. Inside, Layla Voss stood at the stove with her back to the corridor. She wore the red apron, the vivid cherry red that hit the warm kitchen light and threw color back into the room like a lit lantern. Her hair was pinned up, a few curls loose at the temples. She was stirring something in a large pot with a long wooden spoon, her body moving in a gentle, unconscious rhythm that matched the melody she was producing. She was completely, entirely, obliviously unaware that she was being watched. And Chaewon-so, who had stood in boardrooms while men begged for their lives and felt nothing, who had received news of deaths and disasters with the steady pulse of a man made of something other than the usual materials. Jaewon-so stood in the corridor of his own fortress and felt something move through him like a tide coming in through a wall he had believed was sealed. It was not desire. It was something older than desire. Something that predated all the violence and the armor and the empire he had built stone by stone over 2 decades. It was the feeling of a Sunday morning in a small apartment in Mapogu, Seoul, when he was 7 years old and the world outside had not yet declared itself hostile, and his mother stood at the stove in her house dress with her back to him, stirring a pot of something warm, and the sound she made while she stirred was this sound. This exact, formless, generous, unconscious sound. And the boy he had been sat at the kitchen table and felt, in the most unremarkable and therefore most devastating way imaginable, completely safe. He stood in the corridor for 30 seconds. Then he walked to his office, sat down, placed both hands flat on the desk. Outside his window, Manhattan performed its daily enormity. Inside the penthouse, the silence reasserted itself. But it was different now. Something had moved into it. Something small and red and humming that smelled like doenjang and sesame and a past he had buried so deep he had genuinely believed it was gone. It was not gone. It had simply been waiting for the right kitchen. There is a particular kind of man who mistakes control for peace. He organizes everything around him with such completeness, every variable accounted for, every person in their assigned position, every silence enforced, and every sound permitted only on his terms, that he begins, over time, to confuse the absence of chaos with the presence of stillness. They are not the same thing. Chaos is external. Stillness is internal, and a man can spend decades eliminating every source of disorder in his environment, while the interior of him remains a place of permanent, unexamined turbulence. A storm sealed inside a sealed room, turning and turning, with nowhere to go. Chae-won-seo had lived inside that confusion for 20 years. He had called it discipline. He had called it strength. He had built an empire on the architecture of it and surrounded himself with men who feared him precisely because of it. And on most days, in most hours, the system worked so completely that he never felt the storm at all. The 5th week was when the system began, very quietly, to develop a sound it had never made before. It was not dramatic. It announced itself in increments so small that any outside observer would have struggled to name what they were seeing. Mr. Kwon, who was not any outside observer, saw every increment with the clarity of a man who had spent 14 years reading a single face and knew its grammar more thoroughly than the face's owner did. He saw the western corridor becoming the permanent route. He saw the pause at the kitchen entrance extending, from 30 seconds to a minute, from a minute to something longer that he stopped timing because timing it felt like a kind of intrusion. He saw the food being finished, every dish, every night, completely. He saw, on the morning of the 31st day, Chae-won-seo walk not to the entrance of the kitchen, but through it. He entered without announcement. His footsteps were quiet on the tile. He moved quietly everywhere, always. The silence of a man who had learned that noise was a vulnerability. Layla was at the stove, both hands on the wooden spoon, working something in the large clay pot that sent a column of fragrant steam up toward the copper hood above. She was humming. The red apron blazed in the morning light. She did not hear him come in. He crossed to the marble counter on the opposite side of the kitchen island from the stove. He pulled out the high stool that stood there, the same stool that would later become, in some unspoken way, his, and he sat down. He placed his hands on the counter, loosely, the dark gold watch catching the light. He looked at her back. He said nothing. She felt it before she heard it. Not a sound, not a movement. Just the change in the room's atmosphere. The subtle shift that happens when a space that has been belonging to one person suddenly contains two. Her humming softened without stopping. Her shoulders adjusted, not tense, not startled, but aware. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see him in her peripheral vision. And what she found when she looked was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself, in the abstract, for hostility, for coldness, for the blank, pressurized attention of a man who wanted to know why his domestic order had been disturbed. She had not prepared herself for what she actually saw. A man sitting at her counter, with his hands loose and his face doing something complicated and quiet, looking at her the way people look at things they are trying to memorize. She turned back to the stove. She kept stirring. And then, because she was Layla Voss and the kitchen was the one place where all of her careful self-containment dissolved without her permission, she kept humming, too. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the thing that surprised her most. The silence should have been uncomfortable. By every rational measure, it should have been unbearable. A woman alone in a kitchen with a man she did not know, whose household moved with the precision of something she did not have a word for yet. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people who have, without negotiation or agreement, decided to occupy the same space without demanding anything from each other. She stirred. She hummed. The steam rose between them in slow columns. He watched. After a while, he spoke. His voice was low. It was always low. But in the kitchen, it had a different quality than she had heard it carry in the brief, formal exchanges they had managed in the corridor or through Mr. Kwan's intermediary communications. In the kitchen, it was less armored. Slightly. "What are you making?" She glanced at the pot. "Budae jjigae," she said. "Army stew. I know it's not traditional high cuisine, but your pantry had everything and—" She paused, reconsidering. It felt like the right day for it. A beat of silence. Why? She considered how to answer that honestly without revealing too much of the internal logic that governed her cooking choices, which was not the kind of logic that translated easily into words. "It's a comfort dish," she said finally. "People made it from whatever they had. It's not about perfection. It's about warmth. Making something good out of difficult circumstances." He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that she wondered if she had said something wrong, if the answer had somehow been too much, too personal, too near something she hadn't known was near. Then, "My mother made doenjang jjigae. Every Sunday." She did not react visibly. She kept stirring. She had learned already, in 5 weeks of cooking for this man she had barely spoken to, that the correct response to a door opening was not to rush through it. "Was she a good cook?" she asked. Casual. Directed at the pot, not at him. "I don't know," he said. "I thought so. I was a child. I didn't have anything to compare it to." Another pause. Longer. "I haven't thought about it in a long time." "Food does that," she said. "It keeps things for you. Better than photographs." He said nothing, but he did not leave. It was Eddie Park who broke the particular peace of those mornings. He did it, as men like Eddie always do, out of a fear he could not name and would not have admitted to. The fear of being made unnecessary by something he could not control or categorize or threaten into submission. Eddie was 35 and had been with the organization for 9 years, which was long enough to develop the particular arrogance of a man who had survived long enough in a dangerous place to mistake endurance for indispensability. He was vain in the specific way of men who have earned their position through violence and resent any suggestion that the position could be earned any other way. He had a sharp face, quick eyes, and the habitual posture of someone who was always calculating exits. He wore his suits too well, and his loyalty too loosely, though only Mr. Kwan had fully understood the second part. He had been watching the Western Corridor pattern for 2 weeks before he acted. He waited until a Tuesday afternoon, when Mr. Kwan was in a meeting with the legal team on the floor below, and the kitchen staff rotation had left Layla alone. He straightened his jacket. He walked down the Western Corridor with the easy stride of a man visiting a place he had every right to visit. He pushed open the kitchen door and stepped inside. Layla looked up from the cutting board. She read the room immediately. Not its specifics, not the hierarchy that gave this man his particular flavor of confidence, but the essential fact of what he was. Someone who had come into her space with an agenda. She kept cutting. "Can I help you with something?" He sat on the counter, not the stool, not Chae-won's position, but the counter itself, which was a deliberate occupation of territory, and smiled the smile of a man accustomed to the smile doing his work for him. "Just checking in on how you're settling," he said. "Mr. So keeps a very specific household. Not everyone adjusts." "I've adjusted fine," she said. "Have you?" He tilted his head. "Because I've noticed some things that suggest maybe the situation here is getting complicated for you." She put the knife down, not out of fear. She put it down the way you put something down when you want both hands free to pay full attention to what is in front of you. She turned and looked at him directly. "Complicated how?" she said. He smiled again. It did not reach anything behind his eyes. "This is a professional environment, Layla. Very professional. Mr. Saw values order, routine. He's not someone who benefits from distractions. You understand what I'm saying." "I'm not a distraction," she said. "I'm a chef." "Sure," Eddie said. "And chefs can always find other kitchens." He let that land. Let the weight of it settle into the room before he continued. Softer now, almost gentle. "There are people who would be grateful if you decided this particular kitchen wasn't the right fit. People who would make sure your next opportunity was better, easier, without any complications." Layla looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was completely quiet except for the low simmer of the stock pot on the back burner. She could feel the shape of what was being offered and what was being threatened, and she understood both with the precision of a woman who had navigated enough difficult rooms to know the difference between a warning and a fear wearing the costume of a warning. What she felt, standing there, was not primarily fear. What she felt was something considerably closer to rage. Clean and cold and entirely under control. "Get off my counter," she said, "and get out of my kitchen." He stared at her. The smile left his face with the abruptness of something switched off. "You should think carefully. I already thought," she said. "Get out." He got out, but the look he carried with him through the door was the look of a man reclassifying a situation, moving it from an inconvenience to a problem that required a different category of solution. And Layla, who watched that look leave the room, understood with the cold clarity of instinct that the conversation was not over. She turned back to the cutting board, picked the knife back up, and after a moment, because she was who she was, and because the kitchen was still her kitchen regardless of what had just happened in it, she began, quietly and with great deliberateness, to hum. There are moments in a person's life that function as hinges, points around which everything before and everything after pivots, so that the world on one side of the moment is fundamentally different from the world on the other side, even if nothing visible has changed. The hinge itself is often small, unremarkable. A conversation, a decision, a document left on a table by accident. The world does not announce its turning points in advance. It simply turns, and you find yourself on the other side, looking back at the before with the strange double vision of someone who now knows what the before was building toward all along. Layla found the newspaper on a Wednesday morning. It was not a newspaper, precisely. It was a printed copy of a digital article, the kind that Mr. Kwan sometimes prepared for Chae-won as part of a morning briefing on press coverage relevant to various interests. This particular page had been left on the kitchen counter near the pass-through, tucked beneath a delivery receipt, invisible until she moved the receipt to make space for a tray. She did not mean to read it. Her eyes simply found the text the way eyes find things that are placed directly in front of them. She read 3 paragraphs before she stopped. The name Chae-won-so appeared in the second sentence. The words that surrounded it, organized crime, Chungpa syndicate, federal investigation, suspected connection to the disappearance of... She stopped reading at disappearance. She stood very still with the paper in her hand, and the kitchen around her suddenly feeling different. The way a room feels different when you understand for the first time what it actually is. She put the paper back. She put the delivery receipt back on top of it. She walked to the stove and stood in front of it without turning it on, her hands resting on the cold iron grate, and she looked at the large pot in front of her and thought, with a completeness and an honesty that she rarely allowed herself in the middle of a working day. She thought about Atlanta, about the restaurant, the 6 months she had spent building it, the walls she had painted herself, the menu she had written and rewritten 17 times, the morning she had stood in the empty dining room the day before opening and felt something so large and so whole that she had not known what to call it except right. She thought about the year after, the debt, the calls, the slow dismantling of the things she had built with her own hands, and the way she had packed her knives into their roll and told herself that the next thing would be different, more careful, less invested, more protected. She had told herself, no more putting your whole heart into something that can be taken from you. And then she had come here, and she had put her whole heart into it anyway. Into the kitchen, into the copper pots and the marble counter and the spice wall and the broth that simmered for 6 hours because anything less was insufficient. Into the sound she made when she cooked, which she had stopped hearing as sound years ago, and only ever experienced as the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She had put her whole heart in. Again. Without meaning to. Without noticing. And now here was the paper under the receipt, and here was the name in the second sentence, and here was the knowledge she had not had yesterday and could not unknow today. She stood at the cold stove for a long time. Then she turned it on. Because the broth needed to be started by 7:15 if it was going to be ready by noon. And the broth did not care about federal investigations or criminal syndicates or the particular crisis of feeling she was currently navigating. The broth needed heat and time. She provided heat. She would let time handle the rest. She did not hum that morning. For the first time since she had arrived, the kitchen was quiet. Chae-won noticed the quiet before he reached the corridor. He was walking the western route, his route now, the route he had stopped pretending had a practical justification. And the absence of sound reached him before the kitchen entrance did, the way you notice the stopping of a clock only when it stops, only when the rhythm that has become so interior that you stopped registering it as external suddenly removes itself and leaves a shape behind in the silence where it used to be. He reached the entrance and looked in. She was at the stove. The red apron, the bun with the loose curls, the wooden spoon moving in the pot with the same competence and care it always moved with. Everything identical to every other morning, except that the sound was gone. And without the sound, the room was... He searched for the word and found it with a surprise that surprised him further. Diminished. The room was diminished without it. He entered. He sat on the stool. He put his hands on the counter. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was composed with a composure that he recognized as the kind that costs something, the kind that is not natural ease, but constructed calm, assembled from the outside in. He had worn that face for 20 years. He knew it from the inside. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. "I found something this morning," she said. "By accident. On the counter." He was very still. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I read," she said. Her voice was even. She was still addressing the pot, giving him the privacy of her back, which he understood, on some level below language, as a courtesy. "And I'm not going to ask you to explain it, or defend it, or tell me it isn't what it looks like." He said nothing. His hands on the counter were flat and motionless. "I need you to tell me one thing," she said. "Just one. And I need it to be true." He waited. She turned then, fully. She faced him across the kitchen with the wooden spoon in her hand, and the steam from the pot rising behind her, and the morning light catching the gold of her earrings and the red of the apron, and the particular expression on her face which was not accusation and was not fear, but was something considerably more demanding than either. It was the expression of a woman who had decided that the truth, whatever it was something she could survive, and that she would rather have it than its absence. "Did you ever want me to leave?" she asked. The kitchen held the question. The pot simmered. The steam rose. Outside, 43 floors below, the city moved through its enormous, ordinary Wednesday. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Long enough that she began, quietly and without drama, to prepare herself for the possibility that the answer might be yes, or worse, that the answer might be a performance of no. What she was not prepared for was what actually happened. He said, "No." One word. But the way he said it, without calculation, without the careful architecture of controlled communication that governed every other syllable she had ever heard him produce, was different. It arrived without armor. It arrived the way the thing itself was true, which was completely and from somewhere so far down in him that bringing it to the surface had clearly cost something real. She looked at him. He looked at her. The spoon was still in her hand. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Then I'm still here." She turned back to the stove. She adjusted the flame. She picked up the ladle and tested the broth and added a small measure of something from the jar beside the burner. And then, not immediately, not performatively, but gradually and inevitably, the way it always happened, the way she had never been able to stop it from happening, she began to hum. It moved through the kitchen the way warmth moves through a room when a window that has been open too long is finally closed. Gradual, complete, reaching every corner. And Chaewon-suh, who was still sitting on the stool at the marble counter with his hands flat on the surface and the dark gold watch catching the morning light, felt something happen in his face that his face had not done in a very long time. It was not a full smile. It was the country that exists just before a smile, the moment when the muscles remember what they were made for, when the architecture of a face that has been held rigid for years begins, by degrees, to release. He did not move from the stool. He did not speak. He sat and watched her stir the pot and listened to the sound she made without knowing she made it. And something in the sealed room of him, the room where the storm had been turning without exit for 2 decades, went, for the first time, quiet. Not the expensive, enforced quiet of triple-pane glass and 12-inch walls. Not the curated silence of power and isolation. The other kind. The kind that costs nothing and cannot be bought. The kind that a boy in a small apartment in Mapo-gu had known on Sunday mornings before the world declared itself, when his mother stood at the stove and the broth was warm and the sound she made was this sound. This generous, formless, living sound. And the word for what he felt then was not complex, was not strategic, was not anything that required the vocabulary of empire or violence or survival. The word was safe. He sat in Layla Voss's kitchen on a Wednesday morning in Manhattan and felt, for the first time in 27 years, safe. She hummed. The broth simmered. The steam rose between them, soft and unhurried, catching the light. Outside, the city was as loud as it had ever been. Inside, 43 floors above all of it, 2 people who had each, in their own way and by their own long road, forgotten what it felt like to be at rest, sat in the warmth of a kitchen that smelled like memory and something newer than memory. Something that did not have a name yet, but was quietly, irrevocably, beginning to become one. He would not call it love that morning. He was not ready for that word, and she was not asking for it. But he would come back tomorrow, and the morning after, and the one after that. And every morning she would be at the stove, and the red apron would catch the light, and the sound would find him before he reached the corridor. And he would walk toward it the way a person walks toward the one thing in the world that asks nothing of them except that they stay. And he would stay. Just as Layla discovered that her kitchen was a place of healing and belonging, her skin also deserves such a place, a ritual, an intention, care built with the wisdom of generations. Korean women have understood this for centuries, and now this knowledge has been adapted specifically for mature Black skin, for you, Queen, who are over 45 and deserve to see your skin reflect who you truly are. The Korean Glass Skin Secrets Guide brings you the complete AM and PM routine, the 15 most powerful Korean ingredients for blemishes and firmness, the at-home spa ritual, teas that brighten from the inside out, and much more. The link is in the description, in the pinned comment, or point your camera at the QR code that is now appearing on the screen. Don't miss out. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever met someone the world had labeled as dangerous, cold, or unreachable, and discovered that underneath all of that armor, there was simply a person who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe? Have you ever been the person in the room that someone tried to silence, tried to push out, tried to make feel like they didn't belong, and chose to stay anyway? Not out of stubbornness, but out of the quiet certainty that your presence mattered. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about love, redemption, and the courage to remain when everything tells you to run, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.